Good morning, everybody. So my name is Tim Jay. I'm Professor of Psychology of Education at Loughborough University. I'm really glad to be invited to chair this session. This event this morning brings together two really important areas of endeavour in the 21st century. So that's work to understand the science of learning and how we can draw on that understanding in our design of teaching and learning, and work to explore ways to communicate and educate children and the wider society about sustainability and about climate change. So I'm sure that bringing these two contemporary challenges together has great potential to give us new insights into both areas of work. So I'm really looking forward to this morning's discussion. We've got four speakers this morning: Kendra McMahon, Annette Garrett-Cox, David Sands and Paul Howard-Jones. Each speaker is going to have about 15 minutes, and then I really want to see all of your questions for the 5 minutes questions time for each speaker. And then we've also got 20 minutes at the end after all four speakers for a panel discussion where, again, it'd be really good to see all of your questions to feed into that discussion at the end. So I think that's all from me, I think. So I think we should move on to Kendra, the first speaker. So Kendra McMahon is a reader in primary science at Bath Spa University. She's interested in dialogic teaching and assessment in primary science. And I know Kendra mostly through her recent work on a project exploring how to incorporate the science of learning into initial teacher education. So over to Kendra.
Thank you very much, Tim, and good morning, everybody. Yes, so as Tim said, I'm Kendra McMahon, and I'm based at Bath Spa University, and the project that we've been thinking about there is what to do about the learning sciences, particularly in initial teacher education. And that we've been working on this for a few years now with the support of the Wellcome Trust. Now, I'll just make sure I can click through. Okay, there we go. We think there are a couple of challenges at the moment that initial teacher education needs to address. The first is a very big international challenge. We have this burgeoning field of cognitive neuroscience and international interest in the implications of this for education. We also in England specifically have new policy documents, particularly the core content framework for initial teacher education, that emphasise a cognitive psychology model of learning. In particular, this emphasises the transfer from working memory to long-term memory. And I would say this model is actually quite unfamiliar to many ITE tutors. So we have these two big issues to reconcile. We also have some concerns about how we might go about doing this. From the BERA community, there have been concerns raised that this new core content framework takes quite a partial view of cognitive neuroscience, and there have been calls for a more nuanced view, particularly that address social aspects, emotional aspects and sensory aspects in more detail. And we've also had wider concerns raised about how scientific frameworks in general are being increasingly applied to education. So some of these concerns include how learning might be conceptualised more as acquisition than participation. And there are important concerns about the concept of evidence-informed practice and how it might position teachers more as technicians, as recipients of knowledge, rather than thinking professionals making their own judgments in their own particular context. So with these really important issues that we need to bear in mind while considering this. This is our response. We decided that we're going to locate the narrower cognitive psychology within this broader concept of the science of learning, and also the even broader notion of the learning sciences, and make sure we continue to reference existing educational ideas. And to support this, we're developing open access material, and we'd say it supports a sort of compliant yet critical approach to curriculum development in ITE. But I think really importantly, we've taken a really positive stance to this. We think it's a really exciting development. We think it's an opportunity to develop new ideas, and we're really curious about the possibilities for neuroscience and how it can open up our ideas about learning further. So over the next few slides, I'm going to unpick for you how we got to that position and the nature of our open access resources. So to start off with, thinking about terminology has been really important for us at Bath Spa. And the term science of learning, we're taking the definition as encompassing psychology, but also having this educational neuroscience element to it as well. It's quite important to see how this is different from the cognitive psychology stance, which, because cognitive psychology emphasizes observable changes in behavior, this has been quite easily appropriated as a kind of suitable evidence base for advocating specific forms of practice. Whereas science of learning isn't like that. It's much more about providing general principles derived from neuroscience and psychology that are aiming to help teachers making a sense of a situation and thus to make good decisions. So more about provoking a shift in educational dialogues than in prescribing. Also, we found the distinction made by Furlong and Whitty between the learning sciences and the new science of education as two different knowledge traditions in education have been really helpful to us. So the learning sciences see themselves as an interdisciplinary set of ideas. So quite a wide range of disciplines, including education alongside cognitive psychology, neuroscience, and also others such as anthropology and linguistics. So quite a broad conception of learning, and an emphasis on integrating research and practice in sort of real world settings, often through design-based research. And you can see that's different from what they termed the new science of education, which is much more characterised by randomised controlled trials and systematic reviews, and so is more aimed at providing specific recommendations for what works. And we would accept some of the challenges that have been posed by Vera and others to that what works view. It's been really important to have a multidisciplinary team working on this project. So we've got that whole range of expertise. So we have excuse me, colleagues such as Pete Etchells from psychology, Alison Lee, who's a social neuropsychologist, working alongside ITE tutors and myself. And importantly, we've had dialogues with Paul and Annette as well beyond our own university. So to justify for a moment this critical and compliant approach, at the moment, as I said, in the core content curriculum, we have one dominant view of learning based in theory of memory. And this seems to be in line with very influential cognitive psychologist Dan Willingham, who proposed this idea that practitioners just need one theory. And very interesting paper, actually. I would highly recommend it to you. It's asked some good questions. But we would dispute that actually one theory is certainly all that teacher educators need to know. And we would take advantage, if you like, of the fact that we're also invited in the core content framework to integrate additional analysis, critique of theory and research as seen appropriate by the institution. So here are some of the views of some of the most important people in this, the ITE tutors. And these views come from both within Bath Spa and beyond. We visited another 8 ITE institutions around the country. So I'll just give you a moment to read these. I've got a sense there of the range of views that are being held at the moment. And what I'd like you to do at the moment is to type in a word or a short phrase here that expresses your thoughts about the learning sciences in ITE. Give us a sense of what you're thinking about this at the moment. which also seems to capture the response at the moment. Real range of views coming through here, which I'm finding fascinating. Thank you. Perhaps another moment to make sure we've got everyone's views expressed there. Some ideas there I'd be really interested in exploring with people as well. I'd like to hear in what ways unethical. That notion of technicist, yes, I was discussing lacking in framing. Thank you, some really good thoughts there. I'm going to move on and hopefully we can come back to some of those ideas that you've had at the end, either in the questions after this or at the 20 minutes of questions at the end. Confused, yes, that's been a response of quite a lot of people. Okay, moving on. As I said, we've been working on this for a few years and we've developed a website that we've used to share some of our existing resources. So I'm just showing you the page so you can find that if you want to, bathspa.ac.uk/learning sciences. And we've really been taking the approach that we need to support our trainee teachers in becoming critical and thinking about all these ideas with great care, actually. This is an example of something that we've got already up on the web pages. So in this example, we take a claim such as this one grounded in the idea of retrieval practice, that if you give children frequent quizzes, tests, it really helps them remember the fact. So this is becoming quite a big idea out in practice at the moment. And after a quick introduction to the ideas, we then have given our trainees some open access links to some research papers and invited them to analyse them, and to do that through some critical questions. For example, to look at who were the subjects. Were they primary school children? Were they Harvard undergraduates? Was it happening in schools, a laboratory? And really importantly, what kind of learning is being researched, being assessed and being valued? So that's an example of what we already have. And what we're going on to do now is to really think about the core content framework and the statements in that, and how we can support IT tutors in drawing on that in a sensible way as they develop their curriculum. So what we've done is look for the statements in the How Pupils Learn section, particularly, that we think we have got something to say using science of learning concepts. And we've tried to first of all explain the cognitive psychology that we think is underpinning this from the writer's perspective. And then we've tried to take this a bit further, drawing on a broader view, the science of learning view, incorporating neuroscience as well, and relating it to our existing educational ideas. So this is an example of what the page would look like. The know that statement at the top, our developed explanation, largely rooted in cognitive psychology, as these statements are. Then we've introduced some external links to support development of understanding of ideas. And then we've gone further. For example, we might look at how neuroscience looks at anatomical structures and whether there's any of this to support the views of memory that are being proposed. And sort of going further, perhaps bringing in a social view or different ideas from a wider perspective. We've also considered different possibilities across the curriculum. Partly this is about making it manageable and helping tutors to engage because it's of particular interest to them. So for example, in maths, we've looked at the particular relevance here of cognitive load theory worked examples, but also it's been quite interesting to think about how important ideas to maths colleagues, such as a relational view of knowledge, might be related to a neuroscientific view of what how we elaborate and make connections more broadly across the whole of the brain. Issues to do with emotion and maths, such as maths anxiety and finger gnosis, that awareness of your own fingers and how important that is to early maths. My own specialist subjects, thinking about science education, we've, for example, looked at our existing ideas about the importance of elicitation of existing ideas and what they've got to do with memory formation. And we've been thinking as well about what we can learn from neuroscience about seeing the brain within the whole body and to further explore and actually to start to explain in different ways why hands-on learning, particularly for younger children, really matters in science. So whistle stop tour there, quick reminder that you can find those resources. The newer resources aren't on the web page yet, but if you'd like a bit of a preview, we'd really like some feedback, so do feel free to email me if you'd like a copy of those to get going on k.mcmahon@bathsbath.ac.uk. Thank you very much. References there if you would like them. And over to you for any questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Kendra. I really encourage you, I think I'm told there's about 100 delegates out there, so I'm looking forward to seeing your questions for Kendra now. But while those are coming through, I'll ask a question if I can. And my experience of training myself as a teacher was that there's an awful lot to do in 1 year. And so I just wondered what your thoughts are on how possible is it to give enough of this understanding, and with that risk of kind of overloading students, and how much you've also thought about how to continue this beyond that year of training.
It's a huge challenge, and I think one of the things we're trying to do first of all is to support the ITE tutors in coming and getting to grips with this, because ultimately they're going to be the people making decisions about what they integrate into their curriculum priorities. But it was one of the first things some tutors said to us: is this the most important thing? How are we going to do this justice without introducing new misconceptions, actually, which is a real challenge. So it is a challenge. I don't think this is a quick fix in any way. I think we've got lots of questions that we really need to sort of unpick together over the longer term. So no short answers really, but for us, the idea that if you connect it more with the different subject areas has been quite productive, because that gives us a way of sort of mapping some of those ideas more broadly and making it interesting actually for those that are going to do it.
So we've got a question from Cecilia about whether the resources are being shared with ITE providers as well directly, or just with or with schools at the moment.
Well, at the moment they're open access, so I've sort of tried to help people know that they're there. Actually, we're going to go to USET in November and hopefully launch them when they're a bit tidier at that point, ready for the last bit of feedback before we make them publicly available. So yes, so they're certainly there. You're welcome to have a look at them in draft form if you want to get in touch with me, and we'll do our best to promote them. And yeah, please spread the word. We hope they're going to be useful.
Okay, and I can see Paul Howard-Jones has made a comment on some of the words that came up in the word cloud. So we saw you mentioned the word unethical had come up, and it would be great to hear from some of the delegates about what they thought. But I wondered, is this something that you've come across before, Kendra?
Do you know, I haven't come across that particular idea before at all, so I was quite taken aback by that, and I would really like to hear more about that, perhaps in the 20 minutes. But I wonder if there are echoes there of what I was talking about, those concerns that we're getting into technicist territory here, and that there are issues about ownership of knowledge and control of that knowledge. So it may be that lies underneath that. Yeah, and some very real concerns actually that we do need to take seriously and to address. And
I know there is there's so much to be aware of when you're teaching, isn't there, as well? And I guess there is a bit of a concern that bringing in a science might swamp some of the other things that we know are important. So that kind of developing a relationship with learners, and responding to where learners are, and thinking about learners individually. I know there's a bit of concern that bringing in the science kind of homogenizes that group. I don't think that's what you're doing, but I know that concern is out there.
And that one of the comments I listed by the tutors was that the whole scientific framing of these debates felt very uncomfortable to some people, and I can understand that, because education is about something much bigger, and the aims are value driven ultimately. But I do think there's a contribution that science has to make, and as long as we keep it in its rightful place.
Yeah, and think about how we're combining that with all the other aspects, like you said. Okay, well, if there are no more questions coming in, I think it would be good to move to the next speaker at this point. So next speaker is Annette Garrett-Cox. Unmuted again. Okay, so our next speaker is Annette Garrett-Cox. So again, I know Annette from her work with Kendra and Paul, thinking about how to integrate science of learning into teacher education and teacher CPD. But Annette has taught for some years as a secondary maths teacher, and also as a primary maths lead for a number of years. And is still doing some work with Paul at Bristol, I think, but also delivering some tutoring and CPD for teachers through her own consultancy, Granite Rose Education. So over to Annette.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim, for that introduction. So yes, I'm Annette Garrett-Cox, and I've been working over the past year as a research associate with Paul Howard-Jones. So my keyboard has not allowed me to move slides. There we go, thank you. Permission granted. So understanding how learning occurs and how teaching can really foster learning is fundamental to classroom practice. However, although we can see that learning has taken place, we can't necessarily see the underlying processes, which makes it harder to discuss how learning has taken place or why it did or did not occur in the way that was anticipated. But improvements in technology, in neuroimaging, as Kendra was talking about, makes it much easier to visualize what must happen in our brains in order to acquire knowledge and understanding. And understanding some of these key concepts in the science of learning can really support teachers in making informed decisions, in understanding the plethora of ideas that are out there, so they can support the learning processes involved and discuss learning with colleagues. But the extent and complexity of the research that is out there can be really daunting. In 2017, 2018, the University of Bristol, the Sulphite project was funded, first of all, by the Wellcome Trust. And with a collaboration with a number of people from psychology, neuroscience, education, a set of 10 fundamental science of learning concepts were identified that can be most useful. They can elicit insight into the vast majority of teaching practices that take place in the classroom. They're all evidence-based, they're all peer-reviewed. They were then organized into 3 main categories that were intuitively meaningful to teachers. So we had engagement for learning, building knowledge and understanding, and consolidation of learning. So very briefly, to introduce these concepts, there's more data, more information about them now I'll share with you later. The first one, we're looking at engagement for learning. So the concepts cover individual uniqueness, those individual differences in attention. Then the reward system and the approach response. We look at fearfulness and anxiety and the load that can put on working memory and the effect that can have on learning. And finally, plasticity, and the important roles that both teachers and students have in the plasticity and malleability of their learning. Building knowledge and understanding looks very much at prior knowledge, the importance of activating that prior knowledge and connecting it to new learning. Working memory and its, excuse me, in all its many facets and its links to so many aspects of learning. And then conscious and unconscious communication through the mirror neuron system, teachers understanding those unconscious messages that they may be passing on to students and the other way, and how important that is to be aware of that within the classroom. And finally, consolidation of learning, looking at the importance of rehearsal for accessibility. At no time do these dictate how or prescribe how that rehearsal should take place. It simply explains why rehearsal is necessary, and then the importance of applying knowledge in different representations. And finally, sleep, and the two reasons of sleep, both to be fresh for the new day's learning, but also to allow the consolidation of the learning that has taken place during that day, during sleep. So looking at exploring the science of learning, in the first phase, the Science of Learning project introduced the 10 concepts into the PGC programme at the University of Bristol. In this second phase, also funded by the Wellcome Trust, as I said before, we were working in collaboration with the mentors on the PGC programme. And together we were really exploring how these Science of Learning concepts could support the development of students in those important mentoring conversations following a lesson observation. And parallel to this, and we were working in collaboration with Kendra here as well from the University of Bath Spa, we travelled to a number of IT teacher training institutions and some key agencies, including Department of Education, Ofsted, the EEF, Chartered College for Teachers and USET. And the purpose of these visits was to both present what we had been doing at Bristol, how we had introduced the concepts on the PGCE programme and what we'd learnt through doing that, but importantly to discuss the issues and opportunities that teachers, educators and these agencies considered exist in the area of science of learning. From these discussions, what we found, they really highlighted a need for a central resource base, open access resources for teacher training institutions, for schools, for mentors, to be able to access and develop their own understanding, but specifically looking at demonstrations. What does this actually look like in reality? If we're using the science of learning when mentoring, what does it look like? So a key focus of our project was to collect evidence on talking about learning using the science of learning concepts, specifically looking at a debriefing and what did that look like in reality. So the process that we had for recruitment, it was a multiple layered recruitment, many different stages of consent. We started off, we had 14 mentors who were very willing to come into the project. They then were matched up by invitations for all students came through, and we matched 12 students to mentors. They weren't specifically matched to go with that mentor. It was just, that's how the partnering ended up. From that, we ended up with 9 student partnerships, schools, heads, all the consent that came through. Unfortunately, COVID hit a little bit into projects, so we got data from 6 partnership schools, mentors, and students coming together. The first phase was familiarization of the concepts for the mentors, and then an opportunity for them to go away for a few weeks, have some reflection on their own practice, and then come back 2 weeks later for more of a discussion. Following that was a lesson observation, a normal timetable lesson observation from the student teacher. I was not party to that. That was very private, but I was extremely privileged to be invited into the debriefing, where I sat to one side, took notes. A normal debriefing took place. So if there happened to be nothing that was mentioned about the science of learning because something else in context required a different sort of conversation, and the mentor just chose not to use those science of learning concepts, and that would be the way it was. As it turned out, all conversations had some aspect of the science of learning within them, and we were able to draw on those, and at the end of the debriefing, discuss 2 or 3 concepts that we could revisit. The mentor and the student teacher would discuss again, and then have a filmed reconstruction of that. So a little bit about the familiarization stage. We're just going to go back a little bit from that process. So the first stage was introducing the mentors to the engage, build and consolidate concepts. With that, they had a familiarization summary sheet, which all students on the PGCE are given and they can use for their reflections and their planning. But what also came out of that was the need for further opportunity for fluency in these concepts, understanding them. So from that, it prompted 3 videos explaining what exactly do we mean by engagement for learning, building knowledge and understanding, consolidation for learning. What is the science behind it? What are these peer-reviewed, scientifically researched documents that are appropriate for transfer into teaching? What does it look like? Then the mentors were given the opportunity to go back, take 2 weeks to familiarize themselves with the concepts, have a look at their own teaching and mentoring practice, and come forward with 2 or 3 observations that where learning outcomes might be explained by one or more of the science of learning concepts. What we found through those discussions was there was a real positive connection about the shared language, that now student and mentor could really discuss the science of learning in this shared capacity of language, that many activities drew on both engage, build and consolidate all at one time, that it wasn't a 3-part lesson. It was not dictating, right, this is the part where you're going to engage, this is the part where you're going to build. But what it did do is help steer these conversations towards a learning, avoiding that tendency that many new teachers will have, or student teachers, on focusing on what they are doing, focusing on what the students are doing, rather than talking about the learning that is going on. And this certainly, the language helped and the concepts helped discuss and explain unanticipated events. Something had been planned, this is what was expected, it didn't quite turn out that way, and it informed a richer discussion as to why. In planning, in lesson planning, it also helped make informed decisions. And one of the points that came through, and certainly we would advocate, that the engage, build, consolidate concepts do not prescribe how to teach. There are a number of recommendations on teaching styles, or things you've learned up through your own experience, things you've observed from others and ideas you've magpied. The EBC concepts allow teachers to make informed decisions, look at those and think, why would that be useful for learning for these? And in dialogue with parents, particularly aspects such as sleep, where you have students who are working late into the night, preparing for exams in the future, and being able to have that conversation about the benefits of sleep and the downsides of sleep deprivation. So then, excuse me, terribly sorry. We are extremely grateful for the opportunity that we had to be invited into these debriefings. They were an invaluable opportunity. What they did show us was there's a large diversity in the individual differences due to context, due to the relationship between the mentor and the student. And it really reflected that there is no one way of mentoring, but it reflects that effective mentoring can be achieved in a range of different styles and approaches. But unifying all of the methods, or all of the mentoring, were how the science of learning helped formulate questions to dig deeper into the learning. Questions such as, why was that approach effective for engaging other learners in your class? How did that approach help build their knowledge? What was that about the task that made it particularly effective for consolidation? So there were a number of other parts to the story of the lesson, but when it came down to the learning, these were the sorts of questions that were being particularly useful. So the outcome of that, we have 4 videos. Our first video is talking about learning during mentoring. It's an overview of talking about the science of learning during mentoring, and then 3 videos that focus on each of the EBC concepts. Within that, they're made up of a number of different films. So you can see there, the second video talking about engagement for learning is made up of 4 clips. Each clip is provided with context details, lesson planning details, and they are combined with staged instructions or staged descriptions of the science of learning concepts that these videos are demonstrating. So you're seeing what this particular one of the concepts that I mentioned at the beginning, what it looks like in reality. And so finally, putting it all together, what prompted from our discussions with the ITT institutions, where they had said that they particularly would like to see an open access resource. What does this look like? In the same with the mentors and the agencies. So we put together a central means where we can share all of our resources. So I have a huge pleasure in introducing to you our website, the scienceoflearning-ebc.org. So the site provides an in-depth written description of the EBC categories and the 10 scientific concepts that we talk about. It includes the videos that we made following the first familiarization video, CPD. We also have an in-depth guidance as to mentoring, talking about learning with mentoring, and the videos are all there with all of their open access descriptions as well. We have that summary sheet that I was talking to you about that acts as the scaffold for lesson planning and lesson discussions for both the students that we have at the University of Bristol on the PGC programme and the mentors. And then a much more detailed document that explains the concepts in far greater detail, along with all the supporting scientific peer-reviewed references. In addition, there is a report that came out from our mentoring research, providing guidance on how our mentors apply the scientific learning concepts, and includes many of their own reflections in using them. And then there's a glossary. As I mentioned before, the mentors found that shared language was really, really important. But a word such as engagement within education has a different meanings. So if we're talking about engagement within science of learning, what is it specifically that we are talking about? So there's the glossary there, just to make sure that when we are talking about terms, that we know we're talking from a current common page. As you heard Kendra talking about, we've been looking as well at the frameworks, the early career framework, the core content framework. And you'll notice that a number of the words that we have within our science, the 10 concepts, including prior knowledge, working memory, you'll recognize as being featured within the frameworks. But to fully understand these terms, it's important to be able to connect them to a model of how learning occurs. So the science of learning concepts are designed to provide an integrated understanding of how learning occurs, or as one mentor described it, it's a joined up lens. That's one of the things that came out from the discussion. But to look at practice, teaching practice, classroom practice in terms of learning processes, not the only way to look at classroom practice, but when we're looking at learning processes, it provides an integrated explanation of what is going on. So with this in mind, we've provided direct links going from the science of learning concepts to the frameworks. So to give an idea, we have E4 is talking about plasticity. In greater detail, I'll let you just read that. And section 7 So looking at the plasticity that we talk about within the science of learning, and looking at section 7, where they're talking about teachers influencing resilience, well, it's the science of learning research that one part of the research shows there are many successful interventions where they're building resilience has been the focus, and on doing so, they have achieved it through developing students' understanding on the plasticity and the malleability of their abilities. And understanding that success, understanding that link, just makes section 7 become more real, more plausible, not plausible, more practical for a teacher to put into context. So the final part of our website is collaboration partners. We've been extremely lucky to work with many different schools, with different universities, teacher training institutions, a number of collaborative partners. So they're all listed there with all of their details because it's been a great Solfight team to work on. And so finally, that is it. The open access resources, they are also available to schools if they need them. There's a lot of call from schools to understand the science of learning because it's coming through the grapevine. They're being bombarded by lots of different ideas, and for them to be able to make those informed decisions as to how they're going to plan their lessons, why is a certain way being suggested by senior management, why is it coming through? If I'm a student teacher, I'm hearing this from schools and I'm hearing this from the university on my PGT program. How can I make sense of it all? All the resources are there, open access. So my go-to for you, I don't have a pop-up display, but my go-to for you, please, is to have a look at the science of learning-ebc.org, and I hope you'll find our resources useful. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Annette. That was great. We have got a few questions coming through. I'll just say to the delegates listening, quite a few questions for Kendra came right at the end, just as we moved over to Annette. So don't worry, if you asked a question and we haven't answered it yet, they haven't disappeared. We'll come back to those during the discussion at the end, and can ask those to Kendra and the rest of the panel. But questions for you, Annette. One from Rebecca saying, is there any evidence that knowing more about the science of learning changes a teacher's practice over the long term? If there is, what kind of evidence is it?
That is what I would love sulfite stage 3 to be. The academic research evidence I am not aware of. Perhaps Paul will come in on this one. But the anecdotal evidence of speaking to teachers, of presenting it to them, and then coming back and seeing what has been happening in their lessons and how they've been able to explain or how they've been able to describe something that they have changed. So within our mentors, we had a particular discussions such as lesson planning, where one mentor was saying that lesson simply would not have gone the way that it would have gone had we not had the discussion about working memory and connecting prior knowledge, because the lesson plan that the student was originally going to do was going to be a very long introduction and then activities towards the end. With the teacher understanding and using that common language of working memory, prior knowledge, the links, she felt that it had been very valuable. Now, I've got a lot of anecdotal evidence of that, but academic research papers possibly in fruition at the moment. But I think it would need to be a very school-based activity. Obviously, at the moment, there's very little access into schools, but I think that's where it would need to be. Possibly follow up from PGC students, but as you said yourself, Tim, before, the workload that are on students themselves is really high. So you need that school-based visit. But currently, there is not a sulfite stage 3.
Yeah, no, I think I agree that would be useful at some stage, but it's that kind of research is challenging and time consuming to do, so it needs to be thought out well and done well. Okay, another question from Lucy is: have you, as well as doing this with mentoring and ITE, have you or the team tried this with CPD for established teachers?
Yes, it's something that I'm doing at the moment. I've had quite a lot of call to provide this for schools, so particularly with the Cabot Learning Federation, which is a large group of schools, and then we've got another trust that I'm working with at the moment. And it was specifically to help them make informed decisions. So one of the current projects I'm on at the moment is a 7-week program over 14 weeks. The CPD, they've broken down their inset into half-hour slots every other Wednesday to cover the science of learning. And the feedback I've had from there has been that it has been some of the most practical inset that they have received, because it was directly applicable to their learning, to their practice, their classroom practice. The comments such as, they hear about direct instruction, they hear about cognitive load theory, there's all this stuff that comes through Twitter. By starting from an understanding of what is actually going on in the brain, what's actually happening, what is working memory, what do we know, what are these science of learning concepts, then it enables the teacher to make much more informed decisions to understand that concept a little bit more. So if you're looking at cognitive load theory, for instance, and you might be talking about, okay, mathematics, for instance, that evolution of, it's not an evolved subject, we're applying other techniques for it. So should we only be using direct instruction, minimizing all of the evidence? But if you talk about engagement, there is a place for that. But within mathematics, well, all education, the students need to be engaged. You have those exciting moments in maths where it is found between a student. So it's understanding how the teachers, it's understanding for the teachers on how they're going to lead through that process. So that's personally what I found. There is a master's at Bristol University on neuroscience and education. And I guess as there are more of us coming through, then there will be more people to share the knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting how courses on psychology and education at undergraduate and masters are becoming more popular. So there's definitely an interest in mm-hmm. putting these things together. Okay, a question from Justin. So Justin was late because he was speaking to PGCE students about cognitive load theory, dual coding, and cognitive acceleration. So he's interested in whether you, or what you know about what institutions are doing in this area at the moment in ITE, and whether you've surveyed institutions or had any other way of finding out what's going on at the moment.
I think to answer that one, I would need to call on Paul. He's got more of an overview of what's going on in the institutions. Paul, are you able to participate in that one?
Oh, I've been unmuted. Oh, and I've got a face. Yes, I mean, so part of our project was to network with other institutions, and we were doing tours. And I think Annette may have mentioned that. So we were touring around 10 other institutions, getting their feedback, and they were telling us what they're up to. I mean, I think the short answer is not very much. But they're very interested in what we were doing and saw it as a way of them being able to do something that they perceived as quite challenging. And I think it's challenging for institutions for a number of reasons. Quite often they don't have a psychology group to lean on. Sometimes they do, say, at Cambridge, places like the occasional, if you're lucky, you've got a group of psychologists within the education department who can help, much more rarely neuroscientists. But so that's the first thing, is trying to call on that expertise. And then I think that another thing which isn't helping it is actually the core content framework itself, which is quite, it presents a lot of concepts without really indicating how those are connected. And I suppose that's what we've tried to provide. If you follow our sort of EBC approach, then essentially you'll be delivering most of the scientific content, or if not all the scientific content of the core content framework. So not a lot is happening because of the challenges, and we hope that this project is helping to address at least one of those.
And I think we've got time for one last question before we move on to the next speaker. A question from Jacqueline, who's interested in whether teachers actually have enough freedom to plan to use this knowledge that they're getting, and whether there's enough flexibility from leadership to allow teachers to make use of this in the classroom.
From the experience that we are seeing there and the contacts that I've had with schools, it's very often from senior leadership, because they are aware that it's bubbling. Obviously, it's contextual. There are certain schools, certain academies that have taken a stance and they're going with it. And certainly that can prove very difficult for teachers where they have one particular idea, and it's how they can then approach those conversations with senior leadership to open up that discussion. Certainly, perhaps suggesting a direction towards the website and some information might help. But largely, the senior leadership I mean, they've approached me anyway. So the people that I can talk about are those who are interested already. They're aware that members of staff around the school are mentioning different things, trying out different ideas, or they're hearing the buzzwords coming through, and they want to know more about it. They want to be more educated themselves, because not only is it the science of learning help lesson planning, it's helping plan schemes of work, it's helping plan school management. It just gives that informed base on which to make some of these decisions. So that's the evidence that I'm seeing at the moment, but I haven't had opportunity to go wider.
That's great. So I think we'll need to move on to the next speaker for now, because so that we can keep to time. But there's some questions we weren't able to get to that we might be able to come back to during the panel discussion section. So next speaker is David Sands. David is lecturer in leadership and management at University of Bristol, and is interested in how leadership styles might enable school leaders to address climate change education. So we're starting to bring in the climate change aspect to this event. So I'm really interested in hearing what you've got to say, David.
Thanks very much, Tim. Yeah, just to say that this presentation is based on research carried out by Paul Howard-Jones, which forms the basis of a paper which has been submitted to Environmental Education Research. And that paper has been jointly authored by Paul, Justin Dillon, Finian Fenton-Jones, and myself. And at this point, I really would like to thank Paul for asking me to present on the research. My forward button's not working. Let's try the mouse. Here we are. I think it's probably a bit slow. That's what it is. Yeah, let's have a little look at some of the knowns and unknowns at the moment in terms of research. So climate change education, we do know that it's absolutely critical for redirecting learning and teaching in the face of the climate and ecological emergency. We also know that much of the research is coming out of America, coming out of the US, and also that the cultural context in which teachers and learners are operating in is hugely influential on both the opportunities and the challenges which teachers and learners are facing when working to develop and implement effective climate change education. Turning now to the UK, there was a recent poll, 2019, by Oxfam, and their findings were that 70% of the teachers asked wanted to see much more climate change, much more teaching and learning about climate change within the school curriculum. And it was 70% also who felt strongly that there needed to be radical changes to legislation, the legislative framework around which, around the national curriculum, so that the curriculum is actually fit for the times in which we live. Just turning to unknowns, what types of radical change do we want to see? What sort of changes do teachers actually want to support or would wish to implement? That at the moment seems to be opaque. And also an important question is what sort of, what stages in a child's development should different elements of climate change education be introduced? Another unknown is that the level of teacher support for a much broader framing of climate change education as a cross-curricular area within schools is unknown. And of course, we talk about encouraging social action and social change. The level of support and the shape and characteristics of that social action and social change within the curriculum is largely unknown. Thinking about the moral imperatives to develop the climate change education and the curriculum within schools, clearly encouraging students to be agents of change in an action-orientated approach is needed in order to help mitigate what's coming our way. So let's have a quick review of the current scope of climate change education within the national curriculum as it applies to England. Clearly, in this sense, we're looking at the mandatory subjects of science and geography, where climate change education is mandatory at Key Stage 3, 11 to 14, and it's also mandatory in science at Key Stage 4, and it is present in the geography GCSE curriculum, geography being an elective subject. And the way in which it's taught there, I'm pretty sure a lot of delegates are aware there is a focus on the factual content and on the environmental, some of the environmental and physical aspects of the phenomena. So what we wanted to do was to delve into what curriculum content teachers actually would like to see. Try and get some specifics on curriculum content. We also wanted to consider what curriculum subjects they felt should be involved in the delivery of climate change education. We were interested in their perceptions of funding priorities, where they thought climate change education should rank amongst various areas of learning. And finally, we wanted to look at the factors affecting their own personal readiness to teach climate change education. So those were the focus of the actual research. Looking at research design very briefly, there is a comparative context to this, and Paul drew heavily on an American survey, which is up there on the screen, and the questionnaire that was devised as much as possible reflected the structure and the questions which formed the basis of that American research. The sample consisted of 626 English teachers in England, 205 were primary and 421 were secondary. And these were recruited by their attendance at 5 personal development events, which had nothing to do with climate change education. They're actually based upon neuroscience and the science of learning. The instrument that was used, as I've said, was the questionnaire, adapted for the context in which it was used. And the data gathering took place within at the beginning of these events, and there was an adherence to the BERA 2018 ethical guidelines. Respondents were reminded that they could withdraw at any time, and they were also reminded and reinforced that it was voluntary. So let's look at some of the findings. In terms of student-teacher interaction, most teachers, nearly 75%, said that they were already teaching the topic or talking to their students about that, and that compares with the figure of 42% in America. And given what I've said about the scope of the UK curriculum in terms of Key Stage 3, the mandatory elements, I think that's an interesting finding. We feel this may relate to the higher prevalence of belief amongst respondents in anthropogenic climate change, which is nearly 100%, 97.4% amongst that sample, compared to a US figure of 39%. And indeed, there was a strong similar finding in terms of the efficacy of mitigative action to mitigate the issues, that something could be done about this. It may also reflect the high profile of climate change in the UK media, student strikes, which took place around the time of the survey. So there was an attempt to draw up some correlations between climate change belief, to what extent the individual teachers felt that their school was encouraging them to talk about climate change and to teach elements of climate change education. We looked at how climate change was correlated with the teachers' perceptions of resourcing, how much resourcing did they have available to them, and also in terms of their readiness to teach. And we found that there was a small to medium correlation with belief, small to medium correlation between readiness, a perception of readiness amongst teachers, and also a medium to large correlation linked to their perception of how well resourced they were. Looking at different subjects, Most teachers, over half, felt that there should be 6 or more subjects should be within climate change education, and there was strong support for a cross-curricular and interdisciplinary approach to its delivery. And support amongst respondents did not seem to be influenced whether they were geography teachers, whether they were science teachers. And looking at the different areas, there's the top 5. All of them are over half of the respondents. So there seemed to be a very strong feeling that climate change education should be much more widely taught and include a range of subjects. So just in terms of resource availability, less than half of the sample felt that they hadn't enough resources to teach, which contrasted in an opposite sense with the USA, where it was just over half. And 40% of respondents placed climate change in their top 2 priorities. It wasn't close to basic literacy. It was about half the percentage, but it certainly came out in the top 2, and 70% put it in their top 3. And as a first priority for funding, CCE came second only to basic literacy, as you can see on the chart there. So support for prioritising the funding of climate change education appeared homogenous across the whole sample. There was no distinctions, there was no favoritism or sort of stronger views about that within the sample. It was right across the sample. So moving on to views on the primary school curriculum, most respondents, we're looking at about 95%, felt that the science of climate change, its root causes, and issues of global social justice, interestingly, social justice associated with climate change should first be encountered within the primary curriculum. And that reflects Hurd's definition of scientific literacy. Sticking with primary, the great majority, again at the level of 85–95%, felt that the participation in school conservation projects was absolutely apt for at primary level, as was participation in climate change mitigation projects at the school level. And that level of precedence puts it up with numeracy and literacy within the primary curriculum. In terms of advocacy, there was a shift towards a later stage of introducing this as part of the curriculum, advocating climate change mitigation, but it was still within, the majority still felt it should be within the primary curriculum, that is family advocacy. And teachers' views concerning children might take the first part in local community advocacy fell broadly equally between Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3. Interesting research by Trott showing that 12-year-olds can participate very, very effectively in this type of activity within the school curriculum. And then looking at local campaigning, local campaigning was exemplified as a, let me just go back a minute, we exemplified this on the questionnaire as legal demonstration, and most respondents who considered this approach appropriate judged it should occur no earlier than Key Stage 3. So there's a poll here which I'd like you to take part in. What percentage of respondents thought local campaigning should never appear in the school curriculum? If you could fill in that poll, that would be great. Okay, so I can't quite read that first one. Let me just move that out of the way. Okay, the figure amongst this sample was 6.4. Never appear was 6.4%. And then finally, considering civil disobedience, the range of questions that we asked had participation, 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 and finally participation in civil disobedience. And there was a survey on this, there's a poll on this, which we'll go to. And could you just say whether you felt, how many of the sample judged that civil disobedience should be part of the school curriculum? Yes. The answer with this sample of 626 was 54% felt that it should be part, civil disobedience should be part of the school curriculum. Mainly, of course, at Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5. Okay, just a very quick summary. Very high levels of belief in anthropogenic climate change was evident, and indeed that it could be mitigated by action. A teacher workforce in England that seems to be across all subject areas that were surveyed is already teaching and talking to their students about climate change education. It's clear that teachers in England support a broader envisioning of climate change education than it is currently provided for within the curriculum in England, and that this should include social justice and social action within the school curriculum, an action-based approach, and that there should be greater resourcing to support its delivery. Very strong findings on those 2 points. And then finally, from the work that Paul's done, that's gathered momentum, and there is a GEW4 transdisciplinary climate change education network which has been set up, and that's starting to work this autumn, and it involves Bath, Bristol, Exeter, and Cardiff universities. Any questions?
Okay, there I am. So we do have a couple of questions. So thanks for that talk, David. I think that's really interesting and quite promising, I think. So a question, yes. Question from Lucy. So Lucy's interested in some of the recent media attention on government guidelines about what can and cannot be said in schools at the moment. Is interested in how does this encouraging of social action, if that's part of what you end up advocating, sit with recent government guidelines that we shouldn't be undermining or criticizing capitalism?
Yes, exactly. When I saw that come through on the news media, I thought, yes, now there is an issue. I have no answer to that, because the reading I've done indicates that we need to change and reconfigure our economic life if we are going to deal with these problems in a comprehensive and holistic way. So we need to see where that goes. I'm afraid, Lucy, I don't have any answer to how that apparent obstacle. I know that there is a strong movement to take the government to court over this. There's a crowdfund movement which is seeking to get that changed, and I think the way we have to work very hard to allow for a reasonable degree of professional and ethical freedom within the school curriculum for teachers in order to teach what I would argue most people deem urgent and necessary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And a second question from Catherine, which is also something that I've kind of been concerned about with this area of education. So Catherine says, my research is on pro-environmental behaviour of children at preschool age. And she's asking, how can we introduce climate change to children without distressing them? So I've had the same kind of worry that sometimes education could be like seen as giving children all the responsibility to fix this, but none of the power needed to do it.
Well, yeah, I think that's been everyone's concern. There's a lot of research regarding the anxiety which may be sparked by bringing these subjects up and exploring them truthfully and thoroughly. All I can think about is to go back to the notion that social action, mitigation, change is positive, and to use that as a positive underpinning. Or framing of the learning that's going on. I think we owe that to the young people. But at the same time, there's a real professional dilemma here, because if you get the questions from individuals, you have to answer them honestly. So absolutely, it's a difficult area, but I think we've got to frame this as we have to frame our lives, perhaps in a positive way to deal with it.
A kind of related question to the first two, from Mark, who's asking, do teachers see themselves as professionally impartial or as activists in this kind of area?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Of course, this research is based upon a very thorough and tried and tested questionnaire, but there was no follow-up in-depth interviews at this stage. That might be something that we want to go to later, or indeed widen the scope into leadership. So we only have what we have in terms of the results. There was a little bit of post-submission of the article, just consultation with individuals, and it seems that the teachers that I've talked to are very conscious and very conflicted over what they see as their societal and professional duties and their ability to influence young people vis-a-vis the urgency around developing a much more active and focused approach to it. So I think the subtleties need to be explored. Activist or conformist, there'll be a mixed bag. But clearly, what the research showed, and I will say, I was surprised by this, was that 54% really do feel that we need a much more, dare I say, radical approach to the curriculum here. I think that does echo, teachers' feelings that are out there.
I think we've got time for one more question if we're not going to get too far behind. So last one is from Paul for now, who asks, does greater focus on climate change education require different ways of structuring the curriculum to promote interdisciplinary thinking?
Absolutely. I mean, the way in which the curriculum structures are framed around the national curriculum, which has been progressively, shall we say, there's greater option for judgment, and the constraints in terms of content have been progressively lessened over time from an extremely constricting set of regulations that applied. But having said that, the basic structure is still there largely within schools. There are many other curriculum frameworks which many would argue are much more fit for purpose and fit for how we envision education and learning, more importantly, learning taking place within a classroom or indeed outside in the open environment. So I absolutely agree with that. And I mean, the Welsh curriculum, the new Welsh curriculum, I think shows promise, is exciting, and that we need to think about not just the content and cross-curricular, but curriculum structures as well, looking ahead.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, David. And there are a few more questions we can come back to in the panel discussion later, hopefully.
Great.
Okay, so our last speaker for the day is Paul Howard-Jones. So Paul Howard-Jones is a professor of neuroscience and education at University of Bristol, interested in how we apply our understanding of cognition and neuroscience to enhance learning. And in this session, we'll be tying both of these areas together, science of learning and climate change education. So I look forward to hearing what you've got to say, Paul.
Thank you very much, Tim. Just in case I don't get another chance, I really would like to thank Tim J for chairing this session. We really appreciate it. And it's sort of reinforced all my prejudices that if you want a session to keep to time, you need to ask a mathematician. So thank you very much, Tim. And I'll try not to mess up the timings. So, yeah, I would like to thank Martha Monroe. I should say that before I go any further with this, because I knew very little about climate change education, nothing at all really, about 12 months ago. Martha Monroe is much more of an expert in it, and she's been able to sort of guide some of my thinking in these areas, because she actually is much more, well, she's published a good review of what is effective climate change education. And I think that question, along with some of the issues that were raised in David's presentation, the questions that we had at the end there, which were great questions, and actually almost all of these questions are ones which need to be looked at by the research network, and this is why we're forming the Climate Change Education Research Network, in order to address some of these. So why am I doing this? Oops, I shouldn't have done that. Could you pass it back one? Thank you very much. So why am I doing this? I start off and I declare my belief right from the start. Let me be explicit. I believe that understanding why or how teaching approaches can be effective or not supports their adaptation and effectiveness. And of course, this links back to what Annette and Kendra were talking about. The science of learning, the science of the underlying processes by which we learn, they don't tell us exactly how we should teach. They don't provide a prescription. What they do is it's a set of tools to be able to gain a deeper insight into our practice. And if we are thinking that education is an important aspect of trying to mitigate and adapt to climate change, then there is an urgent need to understand the processes that might be involved that lead to effective climate change. And in that sense, I'm talking about change in individual and societal behavior. So 3 steps are what I tried to do. First of all, identify effective teaching approaches in climate education, or climate change education, I should say. And Martha helped me a lot with that. And I lent a lot on her review from 2019. And then to look at their scientific basis, try to understand why they might be effective. What do we know about learning from cognitive neuroscience that might give insight into why those approaches are sometimes effective? And then if we understand that, be able to communicate that to teachers so that these approaches can be adapted as efficiently as possible to the many different contexts. So I'm going to split up the presentation into the 3 categories that Annette has already spoken about: engage, build, consolidate. Let's begin with engagement. How do children become engaged with climate change education, knowledge, understanding? It probably begins very early. And the reason I say that is because we know that culturally induced attentional style emerges by 5 years old. In other words, the way in which we pay attention to an image, or the way in which we pay attention to the world around us, more to the point, is different depending on what culture you grow up in. And that becomes clear at least by 5 years old. But now it appears that we can see these differences emerging in the way in which our eyes move from 24 months. So if attentional style emerges, why might that be important for climate change? Well, let's go into that in a minute. But for the moment, let me ask you, using the poll which has been arranged, what would you say that you see here? If somebody asked you, what are you looking at? What do you see? Which of the options on your screen would we choose? Tim, you'll have to tell me, do I click in order to make the options appear? Oh, you can do it. Ah, great, brilliant. Okay, thank you. So what would you say you see in that image? A fish, some green weeds through which fish are swimming, or a picture of a fish tank? This is online psychology in the making, although I'm not sure we'll be able to publish the results. I guess if this was real data collection, you'd have the option of just stopping the data collection when you like the result. Okay, so this is quite interesting. I mean, overwhelmingly, what we're seeing here is that people are saying, I'm seeing some fish. I'm seeing some fish. And that kind of tallies, if you are a typical Western audience, I think that's what you would expect. We see much less people saying green weeds through which fish are swimming, or fish swimming through green weeds. And the point of this is that, if we can just move on to the next slide, is that in the West, we tend to focus quite analytically. We have a narrower attentional focus, and we are likely to hone in straight in on what's in the middle, what's the most dominant object on the page, if you like. And you can see this through eye tracking, and you can see it not just in terms of where your eyes are going, but also in terms of what you report seeing, and also what you remember seeing. So this is very important for our learning. On the other hand, Asian attentional styles tend to be much broader, and they take more in about what is going on around that central object. And so unsurprisingly, we find that visual attention predicts cultural mindset, whether you're individualistic or whether you're collectivistic, whether you are all about individuals or whether you actually are more concerned with the collective, and also problem-solving style, whether it would be rule-based or context-based. And these types of differences can be used to explain both individual inclinations towards believing in the human causes of climate change, but also national differences. And I'm sorry if the bottom line is just missing out there at the bottom, but national differences in the likelihood of climate action. And in a way, that's hardly surprising, because from an early age, if you're only seeing what's at the center of your attention rather than the way in which it is connected and related and part of the broader environment, then you may be less attuned to thinking about things in an environmental sense, and therefore less likely to take climate action. So sensitive periods possibly, or at least very important periods of development early on in terms of the likelihood of you becoming interested in the climate or the climate changing. But also we might see sensitive periods later in adolescence. Now this is a little bit more tentative, but Sarah Blakemore and others are arguing now that there is an enhanced sensitivity to social signals in teenagers. Certainly this is a time when identity is forming, and teenagers are more concerned about the views, at least of their peers around them, even if not their parents. And we also see that teenagers respond differently when they get climate change knowledge presented to them. If you're an adult, it's likely to harden your beliefs, whatever you already believe. But teenagers are actually more likely to change their views when they're presented with opposing opinions, information, and facts. So teenagers, and one of the reasons for that may be that actually our attitude to the climate is very heavily embedded in our cultural values, our cultural identity. And teenagers are actually going through a massive shift in that quite often. They're throwing everything up in the air and asking, who am I? In a way that adults have already decided who they are and are therefore less susceptible. So understanding the way in which the teenage brain is developing in terms of social identity helps us understand the way in which it may be more amenable to certain types of interventions that have failed with adults. Of course, a lot of the aspects of why a lot of the strategies that might be used to engage children in climate change education come back to the reward system that Annette was talking about. And we know that our reward system responds very positively to social rewards. So collaborative work is very popular and very effective. It's been identified as effective in terms of bringing about behavioral change. And also, climate change is an interdisciplinary area that's very well made for topic working, and therefore it's more likely to provide novelty and personal meaning as well. So those are all things which we know increase activity in the reward system, orient attention, and make something more memorable. It also helps us understand this, using this idea about the reward system helps us understand one very big issue in climate change action, which is the collective action problem. The fact is, if we have little control over outcome, we feel less motivated to get involved. But one of the ways of approaching this is to recast a wicked problem like climate change into a myriad of smaller ones, one of which we can actually get actively involved in. And this ties in with what we understand about the reward system, which is that essentially its response is proportional to what is happening in the context we're involved in, not the greater picture, if you like. Whatever we do as individuals is like to have a small impact at a global level, but it may have a major impact on a local level. And we know that it's that context specific outcome which is what drives our uptake of midbrain dopamine and gives us that desire to move forward. Negative emotions are a big issue in climate change education because it's been identified that eco-anxiety is one of these increasing issues that people are worrying about. Children are becoming more worried about the environment. We're all already worried about children's mental health. And yet at the same time, we know that narratives about the climate that end with a sad ending, in other words, a negatively valenced ending, are actually more likely to produce pro-environmental behaviors, at least in adults. We haven't got that data for children, but this kind of makes sense because we know from a much broader range of literature that you need a mixture of concern as well as hope in order to bring about change in behavior. So this is something that we're going to have to tackle when we start thinking about climate education with children. How do we introduce negative emotions? Because this is a difficult area, and I think part of it will be understanding what we mean by stress, mild stress, and understanding more deeply how all emotions, but including negative emotions, can be both positive and negative for learning. When it comes to building knowledge and understanding, you'll have heard Annette talk about building on prior knowledge. This helps us understand why constructivist approaches can be very effective. Student-centered learning can be very effective in climate change education. But also the way she mentioned mirror neuron activity and the way in which our mirror neuron system in the brain can help us unconsciously, well, not help us, it does it automatically, transfer attitudes and beliefs. And we know that beliefs in climate change among students is generally aligned with that of their teachers. And so beliefs are being unconsciously transmitted as well. And also it means there's probably no substitute for teachers genuinely demonstrating confidence in the existence and the facts relating to climate change and also displaying themselves a personal, authentic response. And yet we also know from the survey that David was talking about that many educators actually feel a bit unready in that sense. They're looking for more resources. Linking to prior knowledge, we also know is more difficult for younger children due to their developing frontal cortices, so they're going to need more scaffolding, more support. But there are lots of ways in which you can help them make links and help that to occur, those connections to occur. And part of it may be, linking those distant global nebulous threats that we haven't made contact with something which is relevant in terms of local action-based project. That again seems to, that enactment of knowledge seems to make an impact in terms of the likelihood of behavioral change. Now, when it comes to consolidation of learning, it's almost as if we've got to reframe what we mean by that, because the way that Annette was talking about it is relevant to the most subjects in the curriculum, insofar as we want children to be able to know, we want them to be able to understand. But when it comes to climate change, we also want them to be able to act. So it's almost that we're saying it's not good enough just to know and understand. There is this other level. And to understand that other level, we're going to have to introduce some more understanding from the brain, and particularly a region called the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. This is a part of the brain that we use when we're imagining the future. So it's very important for us to be able to imagine how we might feel if something happens, and that's called effective foresight. And if it is activating in that, if your brain is activating in that region, you are more likely to do something. It predicts whether you are likely to actually take action. And it predicts whether you're going to take action better than you saying you're going to take action. So this is now being used as part of healthcare, sort of health studies, where they're trying to find out what it takes for people to change their health habits. But it's also relevant to climate change. let me show you, because in this study by Brosh from 2 years ago, they asked adults to be imagining future climate outcomes. And what they found was that actually that ventral medial prefrontal cortex, yes, it's related to the likelihood of you carrying out some action in relation to climate change, but also it varies on an individual level in relation to your self-transcendence, your ability to feel part of the cosmos. And that might sound very hippie and airy-fairy, but this is something that can be measured psychologically. And it's really about the extent to which you feel part of the greater world around you, the greater environment, or whether you are solely focused just on yourself as an individual. And what we find is that ventral medial prefrontal cortex activates more if you have more self-transcendence. And we also know that that is related to taking climate action. So this is actually giving us an insight into the processes whereby becoming less centered on yourself, becoming more aware of the broader environment, brings about changes that are positive for the environment in terms of your individual action. So in summary, this is very much scraping the surface, what I've done today, I have to say, but it gives you a little bit of a taster. And just from the things today I've said, I hope that you're beginning to gather the sorts of messages that are coming through. One of them is that climate change education should begin early because of those attentional style differences. Another thing is that it can give us insight into those negative emotions and the importance of them, and also how to manage them as well. And we're going to need that if we're going to start talking about purposely introducing material that we know will generate concern. And then also understanding benefits from enactment and going out and actually doing things, self-affirming collaborative projects, setting local familiar situations. And that sense of self-affirmation, which I forgot to mention, again, comes about through those regions in the ventral prefrontal medial cortex. It's that region which is so important for understanding the link between what we know and understand to actually doing something about it. So thank you for listening. And I'm wondering if there are any questions. I'll put that link up here just to the Climate Change Education Research Network.
Okay, I'm just waiting for my video to turn back on, but we could, there are a few questions that have come through for you, Paul. So one from Mark. Mark asked a similar question that we didn't quite get to with David's at the end of David's session as well. And Mark is interested in whether evidence around climate justice and whether does the evidence around climate justice overwhelmingly demand a paradigm shift in relation to education. And I just wondered if there's something you could say about the relationship between climate change education and climate justice.
Well, see, this is a very difficult area, because the most important thing is that we see change, and we have to be clear about, I guess, what our objectives are. It's generally believed by scholars in this area that, you know, and if you read Naomi Klein and others, that we have to have a shift away from the capitalist system. And we also need to have much greater attention to issues of social justice, because those who will be affected most by climate change are those in the least prosperous countries. And so I would say yes. The only proviso to that, and this is where things get incredibly complicated, is we've just seen that diktat has come out from the government about not taking information from anti-capitalist groups, and you know, there's that quotation in the Bible, isn't there? As cunning as serpents and as gentle as doves, and research by Lorraine Whitmarsh, for example, who's part of our research network, has shown that as soon as you mention the phrase social justice, you're essentially turning off all the right-wing voters who might be interested in getting involved with climate action. So there's a lot of questions here about messaging, and a question I suppose I put back is if we actually take a totally anti-capitalist stance, such that it actually undermines our ability to publicize and create understanding, and possibly even to reduce action on climate change, that I would imagine would be an unfavorable outcome. So there's some very difficult political thinking has got to occur here if we're going to stand up to the types like Dominic Cummings.
There's a couple of questions. So David and Rosie are both interested in this issue of how children kind of take on attitudes and beliefs from teachers. So David is interested in knowing a bit more about the research on mirror neurons and how there's been research to connect mirror neurons with attitudes and beliefs as well as with motor actions. And Rosie's question is about whether this still happens when we're doing online learning.
Yes, so there's research with adults that show that you will be thinking about the purpose of why somebody is doing something, and so their ideas will be entering your head when you watch their actions. And also the micro movements of the face produce cortical activity as if you're making those expressions yourself and actually experiencing that emotion. So it is a type of mind reading where you are essentially entering the mind of the other person. But I think there are big caveats here that you have to say. None of this work has been done with children. We've no reason to think that children would be any different. I mean, in fact, because animals have these circuits as well. And another thing to say is they're not innate, so we're not born with them. These are circuits that, the mirror neuron system is something we actually acquire as a result of observing others. And it is, it's a controversial area, but there's no doubt that these attitudes and ideas are transmitted unconsciously. And I think few would doubt that the mirror neuron system is involved.
Okay, that's great. I think if we take one more question specifically about your presentation, Paul, then I think it might be good to bring the other speakers back in for some wider questions. But this question for you is from Paul, and he's interested in the connection between encouraging people and children to take action on issues and the connection between that and their agency and self-efficacy. And he's wondering how that fits into the picture here, how agency and self-efficacy need to fit in with climate change education and climate action.
Well, I mean, normally I'd say neuroscience is pretty bad on the free will and autonomy front, but actually this understanding of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex as an important region that's linked to future action, I think is helpful, because it would appear that self-affirmation is helpful. If you do anything that self-affirms, then that is helpful for generating that activity in the brain that we know is linked to action. So what I've been trying to unpick here is the neural processes, if you like, and the regions of the brain that are involved with this link between self-efficacy, if you like, feeling that you can do something about it, and actually taking some action and being supported in taking that action. So I think this is the sort of thing that we might think about in terms of introducing into a school curriculum. And I know that these things have happened in a number of schools, but supporting more of this sort of thing is where children are supported in advocacy within their family, advocacy within the local community, and begin to understand, if we're able to, if we're allowed to do that, how civil disobedience works as well.
And just one more question, because you've been talking about self-affirmation there. Lucy asks, is self-affirmation linked to hope? And is hope important there? I think you've just...
Well, yes. So it's having an anxiety where you feel powerless to do anything, which appears to be psychologically one of the most damaging situations where you have stress without the agency to act in response to that stress. And so, but these, and I suppose what I would say is that these sort of this psychological understanding of stress is really important when it comes to arguments for saying we need to say things to children that they might find concerning, because they, like the rest of us, are going to have to act. So, yeah, I hope that hope will be generated through action.
Thanks, Paul. Can we bring in the other? Can we bring the other speakers back in? And because there's a few questions that'd be good to go back to, and I think there's a few questions that have come in that I think all of the speakers might have something to say about. So we've got about 15 minutes for this part of the session. But the first one I thought we could go back to was one that came in, I think, right at the end of Kendra's talk, but it relates to this. I think it's connected to this idea of science of learning and introducing it into the classroom being potentially unethical or controversial in some way. So Mark asks, do you feel cognitive psychology has been weaponized to promote a particular concept of the learner as a consumer of knowledge? So I know there's a lot of talk about knowledge-rich curriculum, and I think there are at least some people connecting that with some evidence from the science of learning. And I wonder if anyone would like to say anything about that.
Okay, I shall dive in there and have a go with that. Yeah, so I suppose that's something I didn't fully engage with really in my talk, but perhaps it was there in the background in understanding that certainly taking that cognitive psychology position makes it much easier to support certain views about knowledge. So I think I would agree with you, Mark, in that there are definitely concerns there. I would love to have been a fly on the wall when they were developing the core content framework to sort of see how all those discussions unfolded and how it all came together. And I guess I would trust many of the people involved in that to have sort of considered all those issues in many ways. And I think to have built in quite deliberately a bit of flexibility for IT tutors and curriculum designers to make some responses of their own was really important, actually. So that's why I sort of flagged up that statement to say that there is a bit of room for manoeuvre and interpretation here. And I think that's exactly what we need to do, is to do that critical thinking. For example, if you're looking at the studies of retrieval practice, that was the example I talked about. Look at the nature of the knowledge that those studies are positing as knowledge. Is it recalling a list of vocabulary items? And just to dig a little bit more deeply into some of the background. So not to say that there aren't useful concepts and ideas coming from it, but I think that's what I want really, is to have a deeper, more I can't think of the right word, but just have a better understanding across the board, so that when we are introducing these concepts, we can do so thoughtfully and perhaps with some moderation.
If I could add something as well, I mean, I think the danger comes when people point to a particular practice and they say, look, the science says that you should do that. And I think if we are, and sort of what we want to avoid is looking like we're handing, with the science of learning, is looking like we're handing some sort of prescription for good practice, because that's not what it does. And well, this is my personal belief, because actually, if you look at the core content framework and the early career framework, you sort of get the impression that is what it does. But I don't think that's a good way to go. I think it's better to say for teachers to help teachers understand how learning works, and in a way that they can apply it to their own practice. And there is no one strategy that's going to work for everybody. And so when you try something out, if it doesn't work, you want to have the tools available to be able to understand why. And that starts with some theoretical understanding of why it was supposed to work in the first place. And that's what the science of learning is good for. It gives you those tools. And I think it becomes unethical when you start pointing to a lot of very complex concepts that nobody understands and saying, oh, that tells you that you should be doing this. And that's absolutely what we've tried not to do. It's all about providing indicators of how learning occurs, and then encouraging teachers to explain why something has worked or why something hasn't worked, not saying this is what you should do.
So another question that's coming from Jacqueline that I think applies equally well, whether we're talking about science of learning or climate change, is whether our attention as researchers and people trying to support changes in practice in schools, whether our attention needs to be more on individual teachers or more on school and education system leaders for these changes to happen.
I think, sorry, go on, Paul.
I just thought David might be able to say something about that as an ex-head teacher.
Yeah. I was thinking about you got me there, Paul, just thinking of expanding the network here. I mean, I think the obvious answer is both, and to do, certainly, I think that the agency and the power of an individual teacher who, armed with the material that Paul and others has generated in order to come to a position where they really want to improve their practice, but focus on climate change for the sort of professional ethics that they've deemed is absolutely imperative, is really powerful within the classroom. And after all, it's what goes on in the classroom. But meanwhile, the sort of policy structure that operates, and in a highly centralized state such as England, it has to go down to Westminster, and it has to be policy creation there, and influencing that. And I'm maybe clutching at straws a little bit here, but you do hear announcements about COP26 or whatever, next 27 next November. You hear about the Prime Minister wanting to do this, that, and the other, and funding coming through for various initiatives. So whether there's an ability to present evidence which would influence policymakers, I guess I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic that's the other area to do that. Because my sense of teachers, I'll just finish up, my sense of teachers is they may wish to, there's not that many teachers who, through their own volition and perhaps in defiance with, as they see it, the framework in which they carry out their occupation, there is a lot of teachers, a slight diffidence or a slight hesitation about that. There's not that many who will just go for it. And I do believe that some positive signals at the policy level, at the department level, even if they're mild positive signals, we should sort of use those. And I think they can shift individuals quite a bit, that they are looking for that after 20-30 years of being in quite a constrained professional situation. That's all I'd say at the moment.
Any other comments from other speakers on that?
Only to agree very much with what David had said, and really talking about with the workload that teachers have, with the accountability that they have, you need that drive, you need that energy, you have those thoughts. You then need an active staff room where these conversations are going to take place, there you're going to have your meetings that are going to take place with senior management. It's got to come from both ways, definitely. And then having that support, because as much as senior management are going to be wanting to support their staff, they're also accountable for their school outcomes. So it's what's coming in from policy from above. So yes, both ways.
Okay, there's a question maybe more for Paul and David here from Jack, asking, is there any literature or research that links climate change education, attitudes and belief changes with outdoor learning or outdoor education?
Not that I'm aware. You may be aware.
No. So I think it's a shame that we can't say that. I think so intuitively you feel there must be a link, but I haven't come across any myself. I think it's much more what people are being taught outside. It's the content, it's the collaborative projects, the way in which they're structured. It's aspects other than the fact that they're outside. So there's a lot of research to do. I mean, I would love to be able to say, but I as far as I know, there's no study that shows simply taking children outside is going to change climate change beliefs. And in fact, there is one study that shows whether people live in the city or in the countryside, it's pretty similar in terms of their beliefs and their likelihood of taking action. I think it showed that the rural folk are more believing in climate change, but they're only as likely as the urban folk to actually take action.
Okay. So Christopher is asking, does taking a post-anthropocentric or post-humanist approach to education help in transforming attitudes, or do you think that's needed if we're going to have successful climate change education?
Well, I'm just grateful I looked up post-humanist the other day. Yes. Yeah, because I mean, as I understand post-humanism, it's about self-transcendence. It's about saying humans aren't the center of the world, and that is going to make it more likely that your ventral medial prefrontal cortex is going to activate, and you're going to often do something about it. So yeah, definitely.
One might argue
that might link in with going outside. Well, it might do, you know, in certain particular ways, but we don't know that yet.
Yeah, I mean, it might be that such an awareness and sensitivity to the cosmos and our sort of, that we're inside everything, and the connection of all things is a precondition of addressing this problem in schools or elsewhere. Absolutely.
Yeah, so we had another question about whether we can teach about self-transcendence within a neoliberal education system that doesn't let us criticize capitalism. But I think we've had some discussion about that already. So a question from Rachel is, what opportunities do you think there are at the moment for this kind of curriculum change, either with science of learning or with climate change, especially in the light of changes due to COVID, pressures on exams, and all these other things that schools and teachers are thinking about at the moment?
Talking from for the Sulphite Project point of view, the institutions that we visited, there was a really positive vibe to do something about it. Now, we were traveling around December, January, October, November, December, January, and particularly with the frameworks coming out, there was a position of, we're going to have a look. It's the PGT program is really, really tight, but that there was generally a positive vibe that it would be looked at to be included within the program. However, as you've just said, with COVID-19 hitting, the pressures that are on institutions, universities, students across the board has made it extremely difficult. I think the will is there, the time and the level that is required at the moment. It's not necessarily on a back burner. The attention is still there, but it's had to be reduced.
I mean, that said, the early career framework pilot is being continued by the government. So that actually, I was quite surprised actually that they didn't stop that. But it's carrying on this year despite COVID. So it's still that, you know, and there's lots of sort of science of learning phrases in there, even though I would, you know, be more critical of its support in terms of understanding how it relates to learning. So it's clearly quite at the top of the agenda. I mean, in terms of the climate change, I think one of the other reasons why we formed this network is to provide a platform for lobbying government. So I'm hopeful that as we approach COP26, we will be able to produce, you know, a little bit more pressure, hopefully, to try to look again at where climate change is in the curriculum. And because all of the teachers, I think, were telling, well, not all of them, but most of the teachers we were looking from the survey were telling us that it should be interdisciplinary and all subjects should be involved in this. And that was including the science and the geography people who do have it in their curriculum in one form or another. So I think, and they are already, 73% of teachers are already talking about or teaching climate change, whatever their subject, whatever their phase, in English schools, according to our survey. So yeah, I think teachers are great, actually. I know they're under a lot of pressure, but they are pretty good at making space for things that they believe are important.
And the evidence from David's talk just now was that we're in a good position there as far as teachers believing that some of these things are important. And with the science of learning, I think from Annette's and Kendra's talks. So we've just come up against closing time, but are there any kind of last thoughts or comments from any of you, the four speakers, or quick questions for each other?
Just to say just to echo what you're saying a second ago, Tim, that I think the other part of it, from my perspective, is to sort of say, is to engage school leaders, as Annette has already mentioned, school leaders and governing boards, multi-academy trusts, and begin to bring those into the discussion and engage them in the conversation around how a school curriculum becomes more fit for purpose, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess that brings us away from some of the concerns that a lot of this is things being done to schools and teachers rather than schools and teachers really participating in this kind of development, which I think would be really positive.
Yeah, perhaps I should mention that we have got some events coming up in that research network where we are trying to bring academics and teachers together, including head teachers, so that we can map out what the priorities are and the issues for schools in this area. So please do sign up.
Okay, that's great then. So we're at the end. I'd just like to really thank all of the four speakers for all of your talks and your answers to the questions on behalf of all the delegates.
Thank you very much, Tim, for chairing this.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Vera, for hosting us. And thank you, everybody, for coming along.